Chapter 28. Calm Camp. Vards and Nyalis came for her 2 days later. She had already sensed a change in her status. Grange had apparently won some battles on her behalf. The guard had brought her a bucket of water, soap, and clean clothes, although he took her patrol suit once she had changed. Women Lindsay had befriended brought her 3 meals a day. The bucket she had been left to use as a toilet was emptied and exchanged for one that had a top. The women told her that most of the caves were being abandoned. People were leaving, men for battle, women and children for new refuges in the west. Sometimes Sabrina saw them leaving in the early evening, marching up the opposite side of the valley, a line of ants bent beneath heavy loads. When Vards and Nyalis arrived, it felt long expected. To her surprise, the guard who had slept through most days and generally ignored her abandoned his apathy and became protective. He was middle-aged, with an only occasionally shaved face, receding chin, and gaunt limbs. He was also shorter than the rebels who had come for her. Yet, he stood in their way as they waited outside her cage.
"Where are you taking her?"
he demanded.
"We have a vehicle waiting,"
Vards said, his lips curled, his thumbs hooked through his belt loops, and his head cocked impatiently.
"They want her at the calm camp."
The guard hesitated, even though both men, double his size and weight, tapped their feet with impatience. He walked to the edge of the cave, squinting down at what Sabrina supposed was the vehicle that was waiting for her. At his leisure, he came back to the cage and opened it.
"She's been well behaved,"
he said, handing her over.
"If that changes, she'll regret it,"
Nyalis said.
"Chain her up."
The guard gave them both withering looks before plodding over to the box he used as a seat. He opened it and drew out a nest of chains, which he unfolded and wrapped around Sabrina's waist. Fetters linked around her hands and feet and linked back to the chain around her midsection. It was much like the chains Lindsay had worn when Sabrina had visited her in detention. She was utterly helpless as they led her out of the cave and into the sunlight. The sun was burning fiercely, and the rocks were radiating heat like a stovetop. Nyalis cursed sourly, holding his hand to his eyes. The metal against Sabrina's skin went from cold to hot, and Vards complained that she moved too slowly down the hill. She did little to appease him. The heat robbed anyone of much initiative, and she wagered that the effort of hurting her would be too great an exertion. The vehicle was a desert runner with 6 low-inflation wheels and a hinged frame that could bend as they rode over dunes, stolen from the security ministry or the wall watchers. The driver, Rickard, leaned sleepily over the steering wheel, the air above the roof shimmering like water. Below the cab, the engine ticked as its parts expanded in the heat. Vards gave her a push and her feet tangled in her chains and she nearly tripped. The suspension coils squeaked as Nyalis climbed into the front cab. Vards shoved Sabrina into the rear bay, where rusted metal benches, the padding long gone, waited in the dimness of the overhead shell. The ceiling light was cracked and inoperable. Vards did not wait for her to sit before he slammed and locked the door. He joined the others in the front cab. The engine started, the benches vibrating beneath her, and the runner came to life. Their malice resurfaced when they hit the first dune. They slammed into the steep slope at a reckless speed and angle, surely jarring themselves in the cab, but not dangerously so. In the unpadded rear, however, the sharp edges of the benches became life-threatening. Sabrina was thrown against the low ceiling only to crash back down onto a bench, her momentum rolling her to the floor. A latch at the front slid open briefly, and through the dusty window she could see Vards and Nyalis peering at her, laughing. Next, the vehicle veered left to right, tossing her back and forth between the walls. The benches hammered her shins and ankles. When she cried out, she heard hoots of laughter from the front cab. She tried bracing herself against the back door, but Rickard slammed on the brakes to shake her free. When she locked her elbow around one of the handles, Rickard drove them down a dune face at such a pitch that she lost her grip and fell the length of the bay, landing on the window in front. Pressed against the dusty glass, she watched the 3 men howl. Their amusement was short-lived. The shift of her weight was enough to unbalance the runner, and it nearly tipped end over end, the back wheels roaring as they spun free of the sand. They were subdued after that. During the reprieve, the chains became her salvation as she placed herself in the center of the floor between the benches, wrapped the slack around her legs, and braced herself. It made a safety harness, and although the manacles rubbed her wrists and ankles raw, Rickard could not dislodge her without risking tipping the vehicle again. Not that he did not try. He still weaved and bounced the runner up dunes, causing the suspension coils to groan and sometimes slam against the chassis. No roads awaited them, and the dunes were worse than rough seas. Sabrina became sick to her stomach and adjusted the chains so she could curl into a fetal position, her knees to her chest. This was a submissive enough gesture that Rickard seemed to grow tired of yanking the wheel back and forth, and rolled more smoothly after. She lost track of time, focusing on keeping what little food she had eaten in her stomach. After a few hours, when her limbs were shaking with fatigue and motion sickness, the runner came to a stop. Her body still felt as if it was rising and falling, her head spinning. Rickard was yelling out the window to someone. She heard voices outside, a discussion. The door to the cab opened, and the runner shifted slightly with the weight of new passengers. With a stab of light, the back door opened. A slight figure with a full head of unruly hair was framed in the glare.
"Sabrina? Sprocket!"
she gasped.
"You look terrible,"
he said, then turned to yell up at the cab, his face red.
"Did you all beat her?"
Vards offered some excuse about her falling in the back.
"Rough terrain. You sure you want to sit back there with her? She's dangerous." "Shove it,"
he said, slamming the door and climbing in next to Sabrina.
"You all right? Why are you all twisted up?" "To keep from being thrown around."
The muscles in his jaw worked, as if he would crush the white root stem between his molars. This one was different from the usual grass blade.
"What are you doing here?"
she asked.
"Our runner broke down. I told them it would. The steering clamp they were using was fatigued. Never was going to last in these temperatures."
He had brought the desert heat in with him. Sweat left clear channels in the dun-colored dust on his face. A scarf tied loosely around his neck was wet with perspiration. His lips were dry and cracked. He moved closer and tugged a clean strip of cloth from his vest to dab at some blood on Sabrina's forehead. She wondered if Lindsay had stolen his camera. Perhaps by getting just this close to him and picking his pocket.
"You motion sick?"
he said after cleaning her off. The runner was moving again, much more smoothly. Sabrina nodded.
"Take this,"
he said, pulling a fresh root from his vest pouch. After a few bites, taste exploded in her mouth. Tangy, sweet, effervescent. It was miraculous. Her stomach immediately settled. She thanked him while he stretched out on one of the benches across from her, his head resting on his arm.
"They drive a lot more gently with you in the back," she said. "That's 'cause they know I have to fix things. And now we're down one. Fools. Doubly fools that they don't realize it's 20 times cooler back here."
He smiled and winked at her.
"Not that I'm going to tell them."
Sabrina took satisfaction in the idea of the men roasting up front, the sun magnified upon them through the windscreen.
"Where are we going?"
she asked.
"Com camp. It's where the attacks are being coordinated. We've set up an antenna to aid in communications, because our teams plan on trying to knock out the Ministry's communication system."
"The towers?"
"Yeah."
"Sprocket, do you think those towers might do something more than communications?"
"Dr. Rindle has got everyone convinced that they are used to control people's minds. That is why everyone headed to the city to fight is wearing those T-Men helmets. But I'm not sure. I make things with my hands. The brain, I don't get."
She was quiet, thinking, calculating the effects of deactivating the towers. She remembered the woman she had seen wrestled off the prisoner transport, her face covered in gore, her humanity gone. Sprocket drew a palm screen from his pocket, the scenes illuminated on it lighting up his face. Sabrina recognized the noises and the voices immediately. The battle at the wall. The sound of projectile fire and plasma discharges popped and hissed from the speaker. Then they were cut short by an explosion, so powerful that the speaker rattled, the sound becoming more static than anything else. Rocks and rubble clacked against one another. Bran could be heard breathing heavily as he climbed up over the rubble. Then it stopped. Sprocket sighed and began tapping the screen, rearranging pixels, setting up repair algorithms.
"Bran's recorder video,"
Sabrina said as calmly as possible.
Yeah, he said, blowing air out between his lips. Nearly done, I think. Got slowed down because I lost the camera, but I had downloaded it. It's just as well. It was depressing carrying that thing around.
A hollow formed in her stomach, and she struggled to swallow. How long until you finish?
A couple hours. Still takes a long time.
Lindsay's efforts had failed. Sabrina had to tell him before he reached the end. But then what would she do? What if he turned on her, her last ally, and left her here in the desert? It was too much to risk. She would wait until they reached the camp, and if she could, somehow destroy the palm screen. She would make sure it met an accidental end. A bone-deep weariness settled over her. There was nothing she could do now. Maybe Sprocket would sleep. She settled back against the bench and decided to wait. He didn't doze off, but her own fatigue and the vibrations of the runner as it rolled steadily over the sand sea made her drowsy. When she woke, it felt like hours later, Sprocket had also fallen asleep. The runner's engine was whining steadily, the suspensor coils rocking with a regular rhythm. She called Sprocket's name softly, but he was unresponsive. She did not wait. She shifted across the floor as quietly as she could, trying not to disturb her chains. But just as she neared him, the runner slowed and came to a halt. The abrupt absence of noise and vibration woke him, and he sat up, blinking, the palm screen tucked just inside the pocket of his vest.
Well, I guess we've arrived, he said.
Comcamp was nestled in a deep glen with steep cliffs of limestone on either side. Fig and pistachio trees grew in abundance, providing shade along a riverbed at the bottom of the valley, and cover for the antenna that had been erected along the spine of the ridges. A half a dozen more stolen runners, their rear beds packed with what appeared to be ministry cycles, sat parked under the trees. The tires were covered by blades of bloodgrass, their shoots green as spring sprouts, and their tips as dark as a knife pulled out of a murder victim. On either side of a stream bisecting the camp stood large tents. Under their canvas roofs were rows of empty cots covered in white sheets. Sprocket explained that they were infirmary tents.
Hopefully we don't need them.
The command center was a room cordoned off by 3 parked runners and shaded by a roof of dried palm branches. The floor was trampled shrubs and grasses, and the space smelled of broken branches and crushed grass. Before discovering the hospital room in the caverns, Sabrina would have been surprised to find that the rebels had so much material. But now the projection table in the center of the command space, the communications equipment lined up alongside the runners, and multiple screens tracking the movements of soldiers did not faze her. Sprocket escorted her to the center. He had told her they wanted to interrogate her about security leading to and around the head ministry. Except for Dr. Rindle, she did not recognize many of the commanders around the table. She was relieved to see Grange in the corner, speaking with a woman in the same medical coveralls that Lindsay had worn. Something was different about Grange, and it took her a few moments to place it. Unlike the other men, he wore no weapon, not even a knife. Dr. Rindle looked up from the table, his eyes like some sort of violation on her body as they bounced behind his lenses.
Good. You have brought our guest,
he said with a nod to Sprocket. He pressed a key on the border of the table, and a dozen or so red dots imposed upon the screen disappeared and were replaced by blue ones. They were in places familiar to Sabrina, points at which there were security posts along the Bay Road leading from the city to the head ministry. The doctor asked for the number of officers stationed at each post. Sabrina stared at the map. It was rendered in minute detail, the white stone of the head ministry shining like a moon resting at the southern tip of the bay. She could make out the partly deconstructed buildings where she and Moshi were supposed to test out those new railguns and the new augmentation suit. She could still remember the laboratory number on its breast. 11.1.12-9. The road skirted the blue of the bay, past Joseph and Magdalene's, then fed into the tightly packed grid lines of Fortinbras. Dag's dream. She tried to ignore the wave of sadness and longing that filled her. Dr. Rindle's was no easy request. Give away the post's defenses and her colleagues could come to harm. Although she had never felt a great lasting affection from her fellow cadets or officers, she was aware of her oath to them, not to mention her feelings for Sean. She couldn't bear the thought of him coming to harm any more than she could stand the idea of Lindsay or Denalis being hurt. She decided to give them the truth, but no more information than anyone else could glean from driving the Bay Road. "These locations only have 2 or 3 officers in them," she said, indicating the posts at the end and beginning of the Bay Road, her chains jingling about her wrists as she pointed. "How heavily armed are they?" "Overestimate, and the rebels might attack with overwhelming force, killing Sean if he were stationed there for the day. Underestimate, and the rebels might expose themselves. Denalis, if he was there, could be killed." The other commanders were watching her skeptically. She was aware of Grange moving closer to the table. "I don't know. I'm only a cadet. I have yet to be posted there." Dr. Rindle believed her. He slid his fingers across the table, and the head ministry swung into view. "The head ministry?" he said. Sabrina shrugged her shoulders, more confident in the fiction that she knew nothing. "There are antique projectile guns on the turrets to either side of the gate. They do work. The blast doors are thick, but not always closed, depending on the time of day. Once inside, I don't know. There are gardens, fruit trees here," she said, pointing, hoping that the level of detail was enough to make them feel she was cooperating. Their representation already had the trees in place. Even Dag's Fallen Gods installation was marked, making her wonder if his energies would have been better used setting up defenses rather than eccentric artwork. "Ideas are the most dangerous weapons," he had always said. But now the ideas are coming knocking with guns. She had to give them something more. The wounds on her body were aching, her sense of vulnerability sharp. She swept her hands over the building. "Administrative offices are here. Council chamber here. Assembly hall here. I remember it from the tours." She stopped short of sharing Dag and Moshi's residences. She did not mention the laboratory where weapons and suit prototypes would be stored. She shared no more information than any child would know from a field trip to the ministry. Yet she still felt sick with a sense of betrayal. "Anything else?" one of the commanders asked her. "She's clearly answered all she can," Grange said. "Look at her. Sabrina, what did they do to you? Your head?" "I fell in the back of the runner. My fault." "Dr. Rindle, are you satisfied?" "For now." "Good. I'm taking her to the infirmary." "That was not so bad," Sprocket said, leaning on a cabinet of medical supplies while the woman that Sabrina had seen earlier speaking with Grange cleaned her head with antiseptic. Her name was Helene, and the antiseptic she used was cooling. Grange was seated alongside Sabrina on an empty cot, shaking his head. He seemed to be having a conversation with himself. "I've tried to talk them out of it, tried reasoning with them, but they don't listen." Sabrina assumed he was speaking of the coming assault. "Why didn't you go with the others to the lake?" she asked. "If I could not stop the killing, I felt compelled to help with the healing. I volunteered to organize the casualty tents," he said, waving his hand to include the tent and the others adjacent. "Do you expect much wounded?" she asked, although she already knew the answer by the number of tents. "I pray not. But if I am in charge, we'll take wounded from both sides." "They'll say you've gone soft," Sprocket said, not looking up from his palm screen. He tapped a few more pixels into place. "They already are." Helene finished cleaning Sabrina's head and left the room, returning with a cup of tea for Sabrina. Parched as she was, Sabrina drank it quickly, even though it was difficult to maneuver the cup to her lips while still wearing manacles. A garbled noise erupted from the comm cube on Sprocket's belt. He put the palm screen away and put the cube to his ear. He listened carefully before speaking into it. "This is Sparrow. Falcon, do you read?" Grange stared at him intently. There was no answer from the cube. "Who are you talking to?" Sabrina asked, her words coming out slow and slurred. "Denalis and Lindsay," he said, slipping the comm cube back to his belt and taking up the palm screen again. "Looks like it was a false alarm, though." He swept his fingertips across the illuminated face, his brow furrowed as he studied a new image. "If they get Dagosta, and he's in danger,
I'll go get them under the guise of having to go help with communications. Grange will come with me. He'll still have some sway over the men there. There are enough who don't want a slaughter, who just want freedom and justice.
Would those men stop Theopen if he wants to harm Dagosta? Sprocket shrugged.
Possibly.
Grange was quiet, his chin cupped in his hand as he stared straight into space. Where is Theopen? She asked.
Nobody knows,
Grange said, his eyes not moving. All four of them were quiet, the only sounds that of Sprocket tapping away at the palm screen and Helene picking up her supplies. One of the runners rumbled past the tent. Rickard was at the wheel, with Vards and Naelis and others clinging to the side with their helmets on and rifles strapped to their backs. Sabrina felt lightheaded and said so. Helene turned from where she was screwing the top onto the antiseptic bottle.
I put some herbs in your tea to help you rest. They are a natural sedative. You look as if you have not slept in days.
Sedative? No, she had to be awake to take the screen from Sprocket.
No, I don't want to,
she said, trying to sit up, but she was seized with dizziness. Grange caught her cup before she spilled it and eased down into her cot.
It's all right,
he said.
We'll look after you.